Welcome back everyone, Boros month continues. Today I thought I would do a little top 10 of the very best Boros cards ever printed. And this has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that Magic Online hasn't been working for me for the past week. Anyway, so this is a video that I've thought about doing for a long time, finally getting around to it. So here's the criteria that I used to determine which I thought were the best cards. First things first, I didn't count any creatures as their role as a commander. Basically, I'm looking at how these cards function in the 99, just because with the number of Boros commanders, this would basically just turn into like a Boros commanders list if you looked at it from that perspective. And that's going to be a completely separate video sometime in the future. So beside that, each card has to have red-white color identity specifically, which means no monocolor cards and no colorless cards. And finally, the final thing that I looked at is these cards need to be good in a wide variety of decks. So it's not about being really good in one deck, it's about being really good across the gamut of Boros decks, or even like Mardu or Naya. And by the way, of the 51 Boros commanders currently available, I've played 43 of them. 8 to go, and most of those are paper decks, which will be a complete headache. And then there was a new one spoiled in Dominaria the other day, which I haven't counted here yet, but I'm sure we'll get to at some point. Anyway, with that, let's get into the list. Let's start with the honorable mentions. First up is Legion's Initiative. Legion's Initiative has been a good card for a long time. I wouldn't necessarily say it's great or it's the best in its class, but it's definitely very solid, very playable. If you don't have Teferi's Protection, this is a very good budget alternative to Teferi's Protection for protecting your stuff. But the reason that I have it as an honorable mention is that I think with some of the cards being printed, I think Legion's Initiative is actually gaining some steam. With Boros ETB getting some love, I think you're going to start to see a little bit more Legion's Initiative. It's really good in those type decks. And also, it's really good with Storm of Souls, and Storm of Souls is powerful enough that if I'm putting it into a deck, I'm probably going to include Legion's Initiative to go with it, just because resetting the power and toughness on all those creatures is really huge. And finally, there's one little thing that I think a lot of people overlook on Legion's Initiative, which is that you can crack it to give all your stuff haste. If you know that you need to take someone out of the game right now, you can use it for that, and I've had to do that a couple times in the past. So anyway, I think we might start to see Legion's Initiative a little bit more than we've seen it over the past few years just because of some of the stuff getting printed. The next honorable mention is Blade Historian. Blade Historian is very good. It is the type of card that can beat you and beat you quickly. I think its main issues are that it came out in Strixhaven, which was kind of a weird set overall, and also the fact that Strixhaven came out in the year with like almost 2,000 new cards being printed. So I think just with the overwhelming amount of cards that have come out, people haven't seen it as much as I think they would have in years past if this were in like a 2016 Commander deck or something like that. But I think Blade Historian will continue to grow and grow just because it's a very powerful effect. So with that, let's get into the actual countdown. Number 10. Response Resurgence. Response Resurgence is on here because extra combats are incredible, and most of them are very expensive to buy in paper. Response Resurgence is one of the cheapest ones you can buy while also being very good. It doesn't have the untap clause built into it, which can be really good, but it does give your stuff First Strike and Vigilance, and that can matter in a go-wide deck. Because unlike other extra combats, your stuff's still untapped when you pass the turn, which means you can still block. So beyond getting that additional combat in there, you can also defend yourself from the crackback, which is really, really good. I've been starting to use this a little bit more in paper because I've run out of copies of like Aurelia and Waves of Aggression, and these are really cheap. They were less than $1 last time I looked, so it is really easy to get a copy of Response Resurgence. And funny enough, I don't think I've ever actually cast the response side because I know how powerful the extra combat side is. Like, it's pretty difficult to envision the situation where you actually need to use response, and it's some rare situation where you're going to die if you don't use the 5 damage to an attacking creature or something. Anyway, number 9, Fighter Class. Love this card. This card continues to impress me. One, because it's a cheap equipment tutor. Like, if you never level this thing up, it's still really good. To the point where I've actually started cutting open the armory and just putting Fighter Class in instead. There is a point at which you have too many equipment tutors, and what I like about the equipment tutor half of it is that even if you're not playing a Voltron deck, finding your Mask of Memory, Sword of the Animus, Skull Clamp, those really powerful value generating cards that just allow you to play the game and prevent you from getting stuck, it's really good for that stuff, even if you never use the other abilities on the card. But when you get to that second level, equip abilities cost 2 less to activate, absolutely massive. You can do some wild stuff with that late in the game, like particularly late in the game, you have a bunch of equipment out, someone wiped all the creatures, you have to recast your commander, and instead of spending the like 5 to 10 mana that it usually takes to re-equip all of your stuff, and with most of the very good equipment being 3 or less to equip, most of them will be going back on for free, but occasionally you might have to pay 1. Anyway, it's a huge mana savings late in the game and allows you to do other stuff with your mana, hold up at the Fairy's Protection, hold up a Comeuppance, other interaction, or cast something else that you need to make the big play, whatever the case is. Absolutely huge. I don't get to level 3 on this card very often, but it can be very helpful if there's something you really need to get off the table. But yeah, I've really been loving Fighter class, and I think the cost has come down a little bit since its release, which is also good. Number 8, Adriana, Captain of the Guard. This is an interesting card because for the longest time I looked at Adriana and I'm just like, wow, that's a really boring ability. This was printed in the era of the only thing Boros creatures can do is attack. So even for me, looking at this card for the first time, and even many times after that, I'm like, this ability is really boring. However, once I actually started to play the card, I realized how powerful it actually is. In a normal Commander game, you can get up to +3/+3 per combat. Under normal conditions, you'll probably be getting +1 or +2 most of the time, which is actually still a really big deal. Like, it's crazy how much +1/+1 actually changes what you can do in combat, let alone getting +2/+3, or if you start taking extra combats, potentially up to +6 off of a second combat. Anyway, making your creatures really big is actually a lot more interesting than I initially gave this card credit for, and it's also a lot more powerful than I gave this card credit for. If you have Adriana on the board with at least 1 or 2 other good things, things are probably going to go well for you from that point. Now, in the past, I've also talked about how Adriana is kind of bad as opponents get eliminated from the game, because once you're down to that 1v1, getting +1/+1 per combat isn't as impressive. But what I found is, when you get down to that point in the game, you don't need those massive damage numbers quite as much as you do when you're trying to eliminate 3 opponents. So yes, while it does scale down as opponents get eliminated from the game, I still think it's actually very good, and even then, that +1/+1 is still enough to change combat math in your favor. I've been really impressed with Adriana almost every single time I've played it. Number 7. Showdown of the Skalds. I've been putting this in a lot of decks. This card is very good. Now, it's not game-winning good like Adriana or an extra combat or something like that, but it keeps you from getting stuck, which is huge. You get to exile the top 4 cards of your library, and until the end of your next turn you may play them. Card advantage, love it. And modes 2 and 3 are actually a lot better than I gave them credit for initially, because like we talked about with Adriana, even putting a little bit of size on a creature that cares about attacking is actually a big deal. Even getting a very conservative like +2/+2 can be really dramatic in that you obviously have a better attacker, but also you have a better blocker now too. And I don't think blocking gets talked about probably as much as it should, and I know that there's a lot of combo stuff going on in Commander now, but even still, like, if you don't have to lose 5, 10, or 15 points of damage early in a game, it's much harder to kill someone from 40 than it is from 25. So I have been really impressed with modes 2 and 3 in that they are much better than I initially thought they were. And again, this is a permanent card, so it is much easier to get this thing back with like an Emeria Shepherd or something like that than it is an instant or sorcery. And what's great about this card is it's cheap. I've been running this in almost all of my Boros paper decks, especially the non-equipment ones or the ones that don't have all the really expensive equipment and really expensive equipment tutors. Just a great card that really fits in on any budget in almost any deck. Next up, number 6, the equipment package. I'm cheating a little bit on this one and grouping them all together because what I realized is that when you want one of these cards, you probably want all 4 of them. So they kind of travel in a pack together like that, which honestly is just an easy way for me to get more cards into this list. But all of these are fantastic. The one that I probably use the least off the list is Warleader, just because everything does need to be equipped to Warleader itself, which makes it a little bit better as a commander and a little worse in the 99. But it's still very, very playable. But Akiri, Brunner, and Rayav basically go in all of my equipment decks. Such powerful effects that do so much. Akiri gives you card draw, and it gives you that indestructible ability, which is a piece of utility that I absolutely love. Next up is Brunor. Brunor's insane. Free equips are awesome in an equipment deck. We talked about fighter class a little bit already, but Brunor also giving size also matters because now the number of equipment you need in play is significantly less to be able to take someone out of the game. Brunor plays really well into a lot of different situations because of that. And then finally, Rayav. Just filmed Rayav the other day, literally yesterday, actually. Rayav, also very powerful. Obviously, the best thing to do is generate value with swords and the double strike. Getting any sort of double triggers off the swords is a really good time. So yes, absolutely love the equipment package, and again, if you want one of them, you probably want all of them, because that's just how the decks tend to build themselves, but if you're playing Voltron, I would definitely run these. Now, as we get into the top 5, these are going to be the heavy hitters. These are the cards that have been really good, really powerful, really consistent over the years, and show up a lot because of those reasons. And not just from me, but from Boros players at large. Each of these cards is awesome almost every single time you play them, and all give you a really good chance at winning the game. Number 5 is Iroas God of Victory. Iroas is a staple in any go-wide deck, any token deck, any deck that wants to do attacking at all. You're probably going to have a better time doing it with Iroas in play. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to attacking creatures you control. Absolutely massive ability. Pairs really well with instant speed red damage effects like Magma Quake or Starstorm. But it also gives your creatures Menace, which just makes blocking a nightmare. For the most part, I don't see token decks as much as I used to. People seem to be more focused on having like 2 or 3 creatures with really cool abilities in play, which is fine. It just means that they probably can't block a go-wide army as easily as they may have in years past. Not to say there's no token decks, but I think they've kind of waned in popularity a little bit over the years. And then finally, beyond all of that, Iroas is an indestructible 7/4, which means when it comes to your opponents lining up blocks, it means they probably have to put something in front of Iroas, 2 things, as it were. And because it's so big, it basically allows all of the rest of your stuff to get through because they have to block Iroas because it's that big. So Iroas is absolutely fantastic in the 99 of many, many decks. Although I will say, not a fan of it in the command zone. While it is cool, it just doesn't give you enough. So with that, I don't love Iroas in the command zone, but I love Iroas in the 99 of the deck. Next up, number 4, one of my all-time favorite cards. You guys have seen me play this one a lot. That is Sunforger. Sunforger allows you to search for a red and white instant card with converted mana cost 4 or less and cast that card without paying its mana cost. This basically gives you access to all of your removal and all of your protection and most of your instant speed effects in your deck at a moment's notice, which is incredible. Sunforger packages are probably one of the more interesting things to think about because you can always kind of tinker with them for different situations. It's not a thing where you ever like have it completely settled, because like, well, what if I run into a blue deck? Do I bring in a red elemental blast? Maybe you do. But Sunforger also stands out in a number of other ways. Number 1, the +4/+0 is really rare on an equipment. There aren't that many equipment that actually give you that much, in addition to giving you such a powerful ability, and relative to everything that Sunforger does, it's actually pretty fairly costed. Like, if it had an equip 4 or equip 5 on it, it probably wouldn't be all that playable, or at least it would be really hard to play. As an equip 3 that's getting easier and easier to cost reduce with stuff like fighter class, has kept Sunforger very relevant as things tend to get cheaper and cheaper. Because to do the whole thing in one turn naturally, that's 8 mana. Essentially, I look at it as an 8-drop sometimes when I'm building a deck, because you guys have heard me say it, don't ever run out an unprotected Sunforger. People will try to blow it up. But the other unwritten line of text on Sunforger that is really powerful is it essentially removes your opponent's ability to interact with you via all of your protection effects. In particular, Teferi's protection is probably one of the best and goes hand in hand with making Sunforger unbelievably good, but there are many other budget-friendly protection effects that are also really, really good with Sunforger. Going back 4 or 5 years when I was talking about Sunforger in a video, I made the statement that with an equipped Sunforger my win rate was like 75 or 80%, and that's largely still true because of that, because your opponents can't blow up your stuff. If you're smart and you run 2 fog effects, they can't attack you to death. It really eliminates a lot of the things that they can do to try and stop you. Basically, one of their few options becomes do some sort of spell-based combo that's probably in like blue-black or something like that. That stuff tends to be pretty hard to interact with, or at least you need to have the foresight to be running Red Elemental Blast or something like that. But yeah, I don't run Sunforger as much as I used to just because there's a lot of new cards that have come out, and when you run Sunforger, you're probably talking about like 10 or more cards in your deck that need to be devoted to Sunforger. So it just eats up a lot of deck slots, and as much as I love it, at some point you just want to try new things as well. But when I do run it, it's still immensely powerful, and I've been thinking about doing this list for like probably 4 years at least. At one point in time, Sunforger was probably the #1 card on this list. It's drifted down a little bit for me just as like the meta shifted and like my personal taste has shifted a little bit. But that's how good I think Sunforger is. And one final thing that I do think about Sunforger is kind of interesting is that we really haven't seen them go back to that effect on any other card in red-white. It's in that class of, if you want the card that does this, there's literally only one. Which seems kind of strange to me given the popularity of this card. Anyway, that's enough on Sunforger before we have to rename the channel Sunforger Replay. Number 3, Waves of Aggression. Oh my god, do I love Waves of Aggression. Waves of Aggression is so good. There have been so many times in a game of Commander where things are going okay, I'm like trying to put all the pieces together, figure out how we're gonna get there, and then I pull a Waves of Aggression off the top and I'm like, I think I just win now. It's happened more times than I can count, and anytime I have a Waves of Aggression in hand, I feel like I'm going to win the game. And similar to the Sunforger statistics, I would say that like 75% of the time that probably comes true. Waves of Aggression is hugely powerful. Extra combat step, importantly the retrace mechanic, a mechanic that I wish they would revisit for mono white in particular. Because with mono white you get cards like Land Tax, Gift of Estates, and Tithe, as well as many others that put lands in your hand, but those are the ones that I usually go for. And that makes it really easy to discard lands to the retrace ability, and almost acts like pseudo card advantage in that way, because you're turning a land into something really powerful, like an extra combat. And if you want to think about it like this, if you have a turn where you can cast Waves of Aggression twice, those first 2 combat steps probably kill at least 1 player, if not like 1.5 players. That 3rd combat step usually kills everyone at the table. It is rare that anyone survives 3 combat steps in a deck that cares about attacking. Beyond all of that, there's a pseudo combo with this card that's come up for me a few times over the years, particularly if you're playing an equipment deck. If you have a Sword of Feast and Famine and a Mask of Memory, 2 cards that I run a lot, it won't exactly cause you infinite combat steps, but it'll probably get you 4 or 5 combat steps, which again, is enough to kill everyone at the table easily. You do have to hope that you draw a land in there somewhere, and I actually had that come up the other day where I didn't draw the land. After digging 4 plus the normal draw for the turn, sometimes you get unlucky, but usually it kills the table. Anyway, yeah, Waves of Aggression is a card that just makes me smile, because the number of times I've drawn it and I'm just like, oh, I think the game's over now, has really made me fall in love with the card. Moving on, number 2, it is none other than Aurelia the Warleader. The commander that I've played more times than any other commander. I personally own 2 paper Aurelia deck, and if I had the budget to do it, I would make a 3rd. 6 mana, Flying Vigilance Haste. When it attacks for the first time each turn, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there is an additional combat step. So there's a lot of extra combats in Boros. There's a few things that set Aurelia apart. Number 1, it's a creature, which means that unlike Waves of Aggression, or unlike some of the other extra combats, Aurelia is supplying additional damage to what you already have on board. So if you have a 5/5 on board with Waves of Aggression, you get 2 combats, 10 damage. You cast an Aurelia instead, now you get 16 damage, and that's a big deal. Number 2, we've talked about this a lot. As a creature, it's much easier to reanimate it, you can search it out of your deck, it's much easier to do stuff with in red-white than it is in instant or sorcery. And finally, the 3rd thing that does come up sometimes is untap all creatures you control is really powerful against certain blue effects. And I've had that come up to be a very relevant thing more than once. Now, beyond all of that, there are now several combos with Aurelia that are very easy to assemble. Helm of the Host is one, Sword of Hearth and Home is the other, which means in addition to all the other stuff that Aurelia does, it also sets up combos in your decks if you're playing at the power level where you need 2-card infinites. And similar to Waves of Aggression, when you draw an Aurelia late in the game, if you have at least a couple cool things in play, there have been many times where I go, well, I think I win now. And in addition to all of that, Aurelia also allows you to generate a ton of advantage with things that trigger during combat. That's Sword of the Animist, Mask of Memory, Sun Titan, any of those type of effects allow you to get very far ahead in the game, in addition to all the extra damage that you're now doing. She really just does it all, and that's why I absolutely love Aurelia, and even when you see me play like 5-color decks, she's probably in there. There's so many little nuances with Aurelia that don't appear on the card, like the value thing, like the I'm probably going to win the game now thing. She just does it all. I love Aurelia. Which I'm sure many of you are wondering, what card could that possibly be if Aurelia was number 2? So in the number 1 spot, I've got none other than Boros Charm. Based on the criteria that I was thinking about when I put this list together, Boros Charm's ability to give all of your permanents indestructible until end of turn means that you can put this in every single Boros deck, every Mardu deck, every Naya deck, anything with red-white in it, and it's probably going to be somewhere between really good and game-winning. In addition to the other modes don't come up as much, but there have been times where you need to double strike someone else's creature to get a lethal shot in, or sometimes even your own creature. Very relevant in Voltron decks and things like that. But there's also the mode where if someone falls below 5 life at the table, it's literally remove target player. I have had this happen to me a few times in the past, and I'm always a little annoyed when it does happen. Sadly, this card no longer hits Planeswalkers, which is unfortunate because it also used to read Kill Jace the Mind Sculptor. But yes, when I was thinking about the criteria for this list, Boros Charm just has the ability to go in every single deck, to the point where when I'm building decks online, I copy deck lists over a lot and then change, 30 or 40 cards to fit the new commander. Boros Charm is one that, like, I just never touch. Like, it just stays in every deck from deck to deck, and I'm like, well, not taking that out. There has been a few unfortunate scenarios where I've activated a Sunforger thinking there was a Boros Charm in my paper decks, and Boros Charm got cut for one reason or another. Like, probably I just wanted to test out some other card that wasn't Boros Charm, and then you activate Sunforger and you're like, oh god, it's not in here. Well, we're in trouble now. But yeah, the utility and the protection of Boros Charm, it's cheap, it's efficiently costed, and is just good almost everywhere you run it. But that does leave us with one very powerful Boros card that I've talked about a lot, that I'm now including as the bonus section of this video. The bonus best Boros card is none other than Gisela Blade of Gold Knight. Gisela Blade of Gold Knight is essentially the Boros Praetor. Damage dealt to your opponents and their stuff is doubled, damage dealt to you and your stuff is halved. And what she does to the battlefield is really interesting. What I think is interesting about Gisela is the incentives she creates. Basically, the way her text breaks down says there's very little incentive to attack you because you're going to lose most of your damage and your stuff's probably going to get crushed in the process. But there's a lot of incentive for your opponents to kill your other opponents because of the double damage. So what used to be really relevant, I don't see it as much anymore, was Avenger of Zendikar. That was like the green finisher for many, many years. Once they pumped those tokens up a little bit, that's a lot of damage and it was hard to stop. The incentive that Gisela created means that they were going to lose a lot of that damage coming your way, and probably a few tokens in the process, so a lot of the times opponent would attack elsewhere and probably eliminate the two other players while you figure out something to do on your next turn. I mean, Gisela is a 5/5 with flying and first strike with double damage, so it's not that hard to kill someone with Gisela in the air with non-commander damage. If opponents are down to like 15 or 20 life, you can probably find a way to get in there with Gisela and take them out of the game. And so another way to think about it is that if you see an opposing Gisela come onto the battlefield, you're now thinking about the fact that, like, I'm not going to have very much time left in this game because something's just going to kill me if there's any creatures on board at all. You're just going to get absolutely hammered, so you're probably talking about a survival time of like 1 to 2 turns, maybe. Conversely, the player who has the Gisela, I don't actually know that I've seen someone lose with a Gisela on the battlefield. Like, I'm sure it's happened, but the things that need to occur for that to happen, barring Gisela getting removed, right? Obviously you shoot the Gisela if you have removal, but yeah, as I'm thinking about it, I don't know that I've ever seen anyone lose a game with Gisela staying on the battlefield. And sure, you can still be comboed off, and I get it, but so many different type of decks care about doing damage, and if you remove the ability for them to do damage, there's probably at least 1 or 2 decks at the table that literally can't kill you now. And so, for comparison's sake, when I see an opponent play an Aurelia, I get pretty nervous. I'm like, well, it's going to be a lot of damage, things are probably going to get wild here. When I see an opposing Gisela come into play, I'm like, oh, we're just going to die. We're going to die if we don't get rid of that. Like, she just does so much. And so before we wrap up, I'll leave you with one fun side note. There was a time where I had Gisela plus like a Furnace of Wrath or something in play, and I cast a Boros Charm, shooting someone in the face for 12 damage. It was pretty awesome. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this video up here. These are the top 10 best Boros cards according to me. Were there any that I missed? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching. I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel, vote on which decks I play next, or if you want to get some good games of Spell Table, be sure to check out my Patreon at the link below.